Well, hey, welcome back to Harvest Church, Harvest.247. We're so glad you decided to join us today. If you wouldn't mind, just click that subscribe button down there. By this time of recording, we might be over 100 subscribers, but we are trying to hit that milestone, and it's because of you that we can, so we'd love for you to subscribe. Also, go to Facebook and Instagram, Harvest.247. We'd love for you to follow and like our pages there. You can get more information about our church and also go to harvest247.org where you can submit a prayer request. You can sign up to give, and we'd be honored if you would give and partner with us, and you can find out more about our church. Our church exists so that all people may know Jesus and also grow with Him, which we believe is part of the Great Commission. It's not just to tell people about Jesus, but it's also to teach them all that He's commanded and to grow them. And over this course of this summer, we have been going through the end times. We got a podcast called Behind the Harvest Podcast, and we have tried to supplement the teachings here on our YouTube channel with some things that we're doing over in the podcast. So check out our podcast, Behind the Harvest Podcast. We've got through July and August all about the end times. It's a little bit deeper. Sometimes we go a little bit broader, and this is a little bit deeper. So it's just meant to supplement and to try to be very comprehensive here in the middle of the summer, and hopefully give you some great content that you can follow. So when we talk about the end times, I think as long as I have been alive, people have said, or I've heard people say, hey, we're living in the end times. And there's part of that that's true, because what happened in 1947 when Israel became a nation again kind of started that end time clock. I mean, that's one of the major prophecies of the end times, that Israel will become a nation again. And so they came back into Jerusalem, became their own sovereign nation. And so technically people are right, we're living in the end times. And there's been, over time, things have just gotten progressively worse as a society, morally and all types of things. And so I think that leads people to believe that they were in the end times. But I want to say this, that ever since Jesus ascended, everybody thought that they were living in the time where He was going to come back. And that was like 2,000 years ago now, when Jesus ascended into heaven in Acts 1:8. And so every generation has thought they were living in the end times. Everybody thought Jesus was coming back. They thought He was coming back soon, not 2,000 years. And now we live in a time where everybody thinks that Jesus is coming back. But who knows? It could be 1,000 more years. I don't know. You don't know. But here's the thing. One of the things that we do know is that Jesus gave us some hints at when the sign of the times would be, or what the signs of the times would be, of the time of Him coming back, whether it be for the rapture and all that type of thing of the church. And if you want to know more about that, it's on a podcast. It's also on a previous video, like Where Do They All Go? So today I thought I would just open up and go to Matthew 24. Matthew 24 is the Olivet Discourse, and it is the place where Jesus talks the most in depth, the most comprehensive about the end times. And what's great about Jesus is that you can actually compare what Daniel says in his prophecy about the end times with what Jesus talks about the end times, what Paul writes about in the end times, and what John says to us about the end times in Revelation. And guess what? They all match up. Isn't that cool? They all match up. They were all written at different times. They didn't really know each other. And so that's consistent. And so one of the things that Jesus says about the end times in Matthew 24:8, He says, all these, and we're going to talk about what these are but the beginning of the birth pains. So Jesus is likening the end times to birth pains. Now, Sarah and I have had 3 boys, Caleb, Micah, and Ethan. So I've seen Sarah pregnant 3 times. And each time, what I know that happens is that early on in the pregnancy, there's less pain, and it's not that intense. And all of a sudden, as the pregnancy goes on, the contractions come and they get more intense, and they get closer together until the contractions get really close together and really intense, which is a sign that a baby is about to be born. And so what we know is that birth pains, at the longer that a woman is pregnant, they increase with frequency and intensity. Okay, two words, frequency and intensity, meaning they get closer together and they get more severe. So Jesus likens the signs of the end times, the understanding that the end times are close, to birth pains. And so in Matthew 24:8, he just says this, all these but are the beginning of the birth pains, meaning that some of the things that we're going to talk about in this video are the beginning of the signs of the end times. Because as we saw in the last video, God's algorithm doesn't favor you. We saw that in the time of the tribulation, the birth pains not only grow intensely, but they also grow more frequently, meaning that many of them are condensed in what many Bible scholars believe is going to happen in a 7-year period. And that's going to be cosmic signs, economic upheaval, political upheaval, military issues, all kinds of things are going to happen very, very intensely and very, very quickly in that 7-year period. And so one of the things that Jesus, as he's looking out and he's there in the having this Olivet discourse with his believers, he's asked, well, when are the signs of these end times? And he begins to give some clues. And so I'm going to start in Matthew 24, verse 1, and we're going to read all the way to verse 8, and then we're going to kind of unpack this a little bit. So Jesus left the temple and was going away, and his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, you see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. So they're looking out over Jerusalem. They're looking out over the temple. They're looking out over these buildings. And Jesus is saying, listen, all of these stones, all of this is going to be destroyed. As he sat on the Mount of Olives, which is why it's the Olivet Discourse, the disciples came to him privately saying, tell us when these things will be and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age. So like, hey, can you let us in on a little inside information here? Because you just told us all these buildings are not going to be. We kind of want to prep for this. Like, when's this going to happen? How do we know that it's close? In verse 4, Jesus answered them, see that no one leads you astray. That's the first thing he says. He says, see that no one leads you astray, meaning make sure that you're wise. Make sure that you understand what I'm talking about. See that no one leads you astray as to what the signs of the times are going to be. See that no one leads you astray about the ends of the age. See that no one leads you astray in how your attitude should be and what your countenance should be and what your action, how you should live your life. Make sure that you're not led astray. And if we were to read and listen and read books and listen to pastors and all kinds of different Bible experts, there's a lot that could lead us astray on the end times. So Jesus, that's the first thing he says. He says, and in verse 5, for many will come in my name, saying, I am the Christ, and they will lead many astray. And you will hear of wars and rumors of wars. And he says this, see that you're not alarmed. For this must take place. Meaning these wars, these rumors of wars, these people that are going to come in my name and lead people astray, these things must take place. But he says this, but the end is not yet. So there's going to be some deception. There's going to be wars. There's going to be rumors of wars. He says, but the end is not yet. For nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. And there will be famines, and there will be earthquakes in various places. And watch what he says, what we just read in verse 8. All these are but the beginning of the birth pains. So Jesus gives us a clue of what the climate of the world is going to be like right at the end times or right before the end times. And what he gives us a clue in is that us believers who are following Jesus are going to have to experience some of these things. And so he says, first, don't be deceived and don't be led astray. So don't allow someone to come in my name, coming professing to be me, and be led astray, because that's going to be happening in the end times. We've seen cult leaders throughout the 20th and 21st century lead a lot of people astray. That could be, I'm not saying it is, it could be a sign of the beginning of the end times. We've seen other teachers. Some are false teachers. Some teach partial gospel. Some teach not all of it, that have come and they have led people astray. We've seen it with televangelists. We've seen it with prosperity gospel preachers. We've seen it with traditional preachers. We've seen it. So again, that doesn't say that the end times are here. It just says it's the beginning of the birth pains. It's the beginning of the thing that is going to birth the second coming of Jesus. And that as time goes on, we're going to experience them more frequently and more intensely. But the end has not come yet. The second thing that he talks about is he says, you're going to hear wars and rumors of wars. He says there's going to be wars. If you look at the 20th, 21st century, there have been numerous wars, right? There's been wars throughout history, but think about how many there have been so close together. World War I, and then 13 years later, 11 years later, World War II. And then you have the war in Vietnam. And then you have Korea. And then you have the Cold War. And then you have the Gulf War. And then you have the Iraq invasion. And then you have all these small wars breaking out in borders all over different continents, where bordering nations are fighting one another. You've got the Ukraine and Russian war going on in today's time. You've got rumors of wars between the United States and China and the United States and Russia. And you've got all of these things happening. There's wars and there's rumors of wars. So what we know, what we see, is that these things, these skirmishes, these wars, this combat is increasing with more frequency and more intensely. You've got rumors of nuclear war. I mean, all of these things, cyber attacks and cyber wars, and just, it's crazy. We've got space forces now fighting wars in space. But I want you to think about what he says next. But let your heart not be troubled. Jesus is trying to communicate to his people in that day and time and now that there's going to be wars and there's going to be rumors of wars. But let your heart not be troubled. Meaning, I'm in control. I've got it. Just because you see these things happening does not mean that you need to be alarmed. It does not mean that you need to panic. It does not mean that you need to have angst. It does not mean that you need to lose sleep. What it means is just let your heart not be troubled. Understand that these things must take place. These things must happen to fulfill my plan. And what he says is, but the end is not yet. So although in this life we've seen wars and rumors of wars increase with frequency and intensity, Jesus says, yep, don't be alarmed about it, and the end is not yet. And he continues, verse 7, for nation will rise against nation. We just talked about the increase, and kingdom against kingdom. And there's various ways that kingdoms are rising against kingdoms. And there will be famines and earthquakes in various places. So he says, look, if you're looking for signs, you're going to have wars and rumors of wars. If you're looking for signs, there's going to be famines. I mean, we just went through a global pandemic. 100 years after we went through the first global pandemic. There have been plagues, Black Death, all these types of things. But not only that, but think about the frequency of other diseases that we've experienced. We have HIV and AIDS, Ebola, the flu. We've got people, I was thinking about this the other day. Why is it that when I was a kid, I could take a peanut butter and jelly sandwich to school, or they would sell a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, but now I can't because of allergies? I'm not saying that allergies is like from the devil. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is that the increased insensitivity of allergies could also be another sign of, wow, as time moves on, people are susceptible to more things that can harm them in the form of a disease or in form of an allergy or something like that it could also be one of these types of signs. And he says, and then there's earthquakes. I read a stat that there have been more 8.0 earthquakes in like the last 20 years than the previous like 40 or 50 something years. Just crazy. And so he says there's going to be earthquakes. So when we're stepping back as believers and looking at this and we're reading this, one thing we have to understand is that while we see these things happening, it is the beginning of the birth pains. It is the beginning of the time that is the end times. So what does that mean? Does that mean in the next 10 years? I don't know. Does it mean in the next 20 years? I don't know. Does it mean in the next 100 years? I don't know. It could be 1,000 years. But what we do know from what Jesus is telling us, what we do see in the book of Revelation is this, is that as time goes, and as we get closer to the time with the second coming of Jesus and the tribulation period, what we do know is that there are going to be things like wars and pestilence, rumors of wars. There's going to be things like natural disasters that are going to increase with frequency and intensity. And one of the things that we know is that these things have to occur for the end to come, for God's ultimate plan to move and to come to fruition. We know that it's going to happen, and we know that by seeing this and reading it and knowing about what's happened with Israel in 1947 becoming a nation, we know that we are prophetically in the end times. Just don't know what that time frame is. But we know how to read the tea leaves because Jesus told us. We don't have to be surprised by a war. When there's talk of economic disaster, we don't have to be like, oh my gosh, I'm so caught off guard. No, we don't have to do that. When there's earthquakes and everything, we don't have to be like, oh my goodness, I'm surprised at how intense they are. When there's another global pandemic in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, we don't have to be surprised by that and panicked by that. You know why? Because we have Jesus who told us 2,000 years ago what we can expect. And in the midst of all of this turmoil, in the midst of all of these birth pains that grow with intensity and with a frequency, he says to us right in the middle of this discourse, but let your heart not be troubled. So here's what I'm going to say. The so what? Don't sit in your room and watch the news 24/7 and be freaked out about what's happening. Don't worry about the rumors and the wars and all that. We take them in stride with the same thing that we were always encouraged to do by loving God and loving others in the middle of it. And not only that, but we live with a sense of anticipation that says if there's wars and there's rumors of wars, those are horrible. If there's pestilence, those things are awful. And if there are earthquakes and people and tsunamis and things that are hurting people and killing people and displacing people, those things are awful. And yet at the same time, we also know that these are the beginning of birth pains that are going to run through the tribulation and grow with frequency and grow in intensity. And all it is just signaling to us Jesus is coming back soon. So don't let your heart be worried. Don't let your heart be troubled. And here's the better part. When you're walking around the neighborhood with your friend, or you're sitting next to your coworker, or you're having coffee with someone, or you're, whatever it is, and they begin to say, oh my goodness, I can't believe what's going on in the world. Can you believe about this? Can you believe about that? It's a phenomenal opportunity to take out the book of Matthew and turn to 24 and say, hey, can I just share with you something? In my faith, we anticipate and we expect this. Why? Because we have a Savior who loves us so much that 2,000 years ago, He told us what to look for. And that these would be the signs of the end times. And these would be the signs of His coming. And this is a perfect opportunity for you to accept Him and to be a follower of Him before this time comes. Because then guess what? You can kind of live your best life now without any worry and understand we're going to go through some tribulation. We're going to go through some difficult times. But we can still keep those main things, faith, hope, and love, alive as we follow Jesus through them. Thanks so much for checking us out. God bless you.